workshop seminar. We're very pleased to introduce Paddy O'Halloran. He is presenting his work, Historical Perspectives and Methods for Re-examining Xenophobia in Contemporary South Africa. Paddy is joining us all the way from Maine. He's presenting his work from there. Paddy is a NRF postdoctoral fellow in the African Center for Migration and Society. He holds a PhD in history from the University of the Witwatersrand, and his work deals with the politicization of foreignness in Africa and the Atlantic world. So thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to hand over to Paddy now to present his work. So just to give you the layout, Paddy will be presenting for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll hand over for question and answer afterwards. Paddy, show is yours.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. You have to forgive me if I'm a little bit slow. It's just 7 a.m. here, so I'd usually be thinking about breakfast. And so this xenophobia stuff is a little bit heavy. But I have had breakfast, in case you're wondering. But I'm glad to be joining you, glad to be back at the history workshop in a way. And pleased to see you all here. So this paper, to just jump into it, this paper is what I see as an endpoint of sorts to one of the questions that I began my PhD with, which was about how we can use history differently to study xenophobia. How can we use history without just looking for origins of xenophobia in the past? And as I say, it's kind of an endpoint to that question because in the course of doing the research, there have been other directions opened up that I think should be explored, but this one I didn't want to leave hanging. The question originated in the contemporary politics of xenophobia in South Africa, so that's why it's geared towards that particular context. And so some of you who were at my PhD proposal 5 years ago will find some of this familiar. Though from what I can see, most of you weren't there, but if you were there, it'll be familiar. But I've since, of course, done research, so there's something more to say. Now, I presented this as a work in progress seminar at ACMS, the Migration Center, a few weeks ago. And one of the questions or comments that I got there was about why, the question was, why is why a problem? For those who've read the paper, you'll know that I talk about the problem of why. Why is there xenophobia and the problem of searching for causes or origins, the idea that may not be the best question to ask. If you haven't read the paper, now you know. Now you know. So why is why a problem? I was asked to be more clear about that in the paper, which I haven't done. I haven't revised it since giving that talk. But I thought I would dwell a little bit on that question today, partly for my own purposes, but because I think it is the key question, and it will help me articulate to you what this paper is about. So why is why the problem was the question, and I think it might be useful to compare briefly, without getting into whole other worlds of scholarship, but to briefly compare the study of xenophobia to, say, the study of racism and the study of social movements. And if you are familiar with either of those, which most of you probably are in some way, we see that the question of why there is racism or why there are social movements are not the main questions. They appear in very interesting and illuminating ways, also sometimes in reductive ways. The question is there, but usually what we're focused on is not what are the origins of social movements or why is there racism. You know, in the study of racism, there is a, you know, we're deeply concerned with the ways it appears and where it is implicated in institutions or in collective worldviews, collective actions. The main question is not what causes it, and there's also a great deal of complexity articulated about racism, that particular form of exclusion that has to do with race, difference perceived as racial, that it manifests in different ways, that it is different in different contexts, different for different people. Likewise, with social movements, we're concerned with how they change their context, what their internal dynamics are, what the contradictions are, what contradictions are exposed, either in the wider society that they're operating in or internally. And yet, when we think about xenophobia, and I'll speak specifically about the context of South African scholarship. When we think about xenophobia, it's often unlike the exclusions around race, which are understood as complex. Xenophobia is often understood as in a couple of simple ways. Either people just don't like immigrants or foreign nationals, whatever the term being used in, depending on context, that term changes, or there's some kind of a straightforward reason that people misguidedly don't care for the presence of those people, whether it's competition in the job market or just in the economy, whether there's some kind of cultural difference, even biological difference. These are things that have been argued, but it comes without that great deal of complexity that we see in the study of racism, which I think is a shortcoming. And it's not only in South Africa. This is also true of the United States. And then, unlike social movements, where we're interested in a great deal of very sophisticated questions about a particular movement or about movements in general, the politics mobilizations around xenophobia are also often taken as something straightforward. They happen because of this, and this is why I think why is a problem, and cause and origin aren't the best questions. They happen because of this, and that's what it is. But they're not subjected to that hard questioning that other social movements, if we can call it a social movement, other social movements are. Questions that are asked of other social movements, and there's certain issues there when a lot of the time there isn't a definable movement organization, and also it's harder to talk to people about xenophobia. There's people doing it, but it's harder to do maybe than to talk about how they're democratizing local governments. You know, that it's a different kind of politics. But nonetheless, the types of questions are what I'm getting at. So I think at this point, when there has been some kind of xenophobic mobilization off and on, and by many accounts, and as we've observed increasingly in certain ways in South Africa, that the question of why it's there is not what we should be necessarily focusing on, but to start to think about its complexity, and to think about how it manifests itself and how people mobilize it. And there are people doing this, but if you follow the literature on xenophobia in South Africa, there's a trend actually away from, in speaking in general terms and about sort of quantity of published pieces, published work. There's a trend away from dealing with the complexity that kind of reached a peak after 2008 and around 2010, 2011, 12. There's a trend away from dealing with its complexity and to treating it as something that's just assumed to be. We don't need to ask what it is anymore. We don't need to worry about how it's affecting the context. Usually it's just something bad, and why is it happening? That's sort of the approach. Again, not to exclude those approaches that are very interesting and good, but this is a trend that I've noticed. So this paper is kind of a provocation, meant to be a provocation in that context of dismissal in a way. There's in light of that trend, I think we need to shake up the conversation a little bit. And so back to my original question, which was how can we use history to do that? Sorry, I've shaken my computer. How do we use history to do that without looking just for origins and causes? Because a lot of historical studies have done that. And on another note, there is, to me, a problem of asking that question of history too, because then we get to the sort of a baseline assumption that because of this history, there is and will be xenophobia. It achieves a kind of inevitability, and which is not to say that every historian looking for the causes of xenophobia assumes that xenophobia, because it has a cause, is inevitable, but that it creates assumptions about xenophobia or any politics when we do that kind of historical research into the origins of something. And that runs up against all of the many complexities and contradictions of xenophobia in South Africa. Sometimes people will mobilize against xenophobia, but make xenophobic expressions at other times. There's also been multiple targets of xenophobia, whether they're from other African countries, whether they're Muslim, whether they're from South Asia, and not always at the same time and in the same place. These forms of xenophobia sometimes relate to developments that may not stay relevant in every case. 2001, there was a lot happening in Zimbabwe, and that may have impacted the South Africans' perspective on Zimbabwean migrants. There was some of the earliest, neighborhood-led evictions of immigrants were around that time, 2001. Not the first, but some of. And so, yeah, if our concern is with the origins of xenophobia, then are we missing out on being able to deal with these things? So I'm not saying I answered how to deal with these things in this paper or with my research, but I did, at least for myself, create some insight, which has to do with the multiplicity of xenophobia and xenophobic mobilizations in a particular context, and the different meanings given to foreignness when through different political concerns. So to be very brief, there were three major, this research was about the Cape Colony. Let me go back to the beginning a little bit here. This research was about the Cape Colony in the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century, and the forms of xenophobia that that appeared and were mobilized in colonial society. So there were three main types. One had to do with the frontier, and it was related to the creation of boundaries and the relationship between colonists, not necessarily the colonial government. The colonists had opinions about that, but colonists and chiefly authority and mobile African people. The second had to do with more internal forms of mobility. The movement of both African and European people within the colony and out of the colony. The ways that people ran away. There was a lot of concern about deserters and what they called vagabonds and vagrants, whether these were soldiers who had deserted the British Army, whether these were runaway slaves up to the 1830s, whether it was runaway indentured servants, etc. And the idea of foreignness was deeply implicated in this because of the fear that they would, these mobile people, indecently mobile people in the perspective that I'm talking about, would form connections with so-called foreign, and that was explicitly expressed, foreign people, foreign centers of political authority, foreign threats to the colony. And sometimes foreignness was explicitly political. It was, there was a missionaries were described as having a foreign alien influence. And so these runaway people from the colony, or else African people who were moving to mission stations, were seen as being under that alien influence. And then the third way had to do with the designation of the Cape Colony as a penal settlement for the transportation of convicted felons from the British Empire, but it fell out that basically it was from Britain and Ireland, and which actually the same at the time were the same, but were the United Kingdom. But anyway, so there was a rejection of these people, about 300 men, who were being transported to the colony. They were never allowed to land, and they eventually went to Australia. But they the discourses around them were basically set them up as foreigners, as unwanted immigrants, because for all of the moral corruption that, of course, a bunch of convicted criminals would have. That's how that was expressed. These people will ruin the society, the colonial society, by their presence. And not only that, but they'll make common cause with all the vagabonds and all of the independent Africans, and then there'll be no more colony. That was basically the idea. But what's interesting about these three things, now that you have them in a more or less articulate way, kind of, as I said, it's early, but the interesting thing about these three things is the way they interrelate and the way that they articulate changing ideas of foreignness, but also some very consistent ideas. And those have to do with what they called improper connections, those relationships between people and foreignness, foreigners, foreign political authorities, foreign people in general, how foreignness was racialized in a certain way, but that it wasn't just about the race or the ethnicity or the national origin of the so-called foreigner. Instead, the local politics of race in the colony were used to articulate the threats of foreigners, whether they were from Ireland or England, or whether they were indigenous. And so I think that the way that these multiple xenophobias interrelated, and the way that they it's getting bright, sorry. The way that they interrelated and the way that they articulate a whole, a context, and a shifting context, can be useful for thinking about the present. And I think we can do that by shifting away from asking why or what is the cause of xenophobia, and thinking about its mobilizations and manifestations and its discourses that that will give us a lot. We'll still be dealing with a lot of the same things, but from a different angle. So, the questions in the Cape Colony were also about the economy, but it wasn't, there's a need for laborers, so we just have to control the movement of people. Therefore, mobile people are a problem, because it wasn't, in terms of the foreignness aspect, the politicization of foreignness and xenophobia, it wasn't that simple. There was more to be said than that. And I think it's the same if we think about the present, economic questions in the present, or demographic questions in the present. They're there, but I think that we can approach them not only as causes, but as something that people are political about. As I said, I made the comparison earlier to how we study racism, how we study social movements. I think those would be, those are good models. The good research are good models. And I also think that history, despite having, apart from just having a comparative value, as I've tried to express this morning, but apart from being comparative, history can also be a type of method where we're investing in describing a context basically that we don't know. I think a lot of one of the problems that we deal with in dealing with the present is that we assume a lot about it that we don't about the past. And by asking different questions, starting from the assumption that we want to find out what xenophobia is in this context, what did foreignness mean, or what does foreignness mean? How do our people articulate it, and what threats, if they do suppose there are threats, what threats do they perceive there? So beginning with what is xenophobia? And then moving through how it's articulated, how it is mobilized, and the different relationships between different forms of xenophobia. I think that that's what I'm trying to show in this paper, is an approach we can use. And as I said at the beginning, it is meant to be provocative. So it may have been, but I think I should stop there. I'd really like to hear what your ideas are.
All right. Thanks, Paddy. Thanks for that. I am the late coming chair. Well, was supposed to be, but I got held up in traffic. But thank you for your provocative paper. At this point, we're going to be taking questions and comments, and everyone is also welcome to use the chat to post questions. Oh, I forgot, my name is Tugelo Nhlapo. I'm the student in the history workshop. All right, we can take questions. I mean, you don't have to raise your hand. You can just go for it. Yeah. Okay, maybe I should go for it to sort of kick off this. I read a bit of your paper, but I didn't get through all of it. So I think what was interesting for me is how you were saying we shouldn't ask why it's happening. Rather, we should be asking sort of different questions. So, and you did say that, you know, it's meant to be provocative. So I sort of, so I guess my question is, where do you see this sort of, you know, way of thinking about xenophobia and foreignness, particularly linking it to, you know, what's been happening recently with the Dudula movement? Because, you know, yeah.
Could you repeat the question? Where do I see this way of thinking?
Yeah. So where does it lead to? I mean, because you mentioned also the way that you're also linking it to the way it organizes itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah.
Okay. Well, it is very. I want to be very clear that it's not meant to solve. It's not meant to solve anything. By thinking differently, by getting away from the question of origins or causes. It won't, just by thinking that way, doing research that way, it will not address xenophobia as a problem. But it will, I think, force a deeper understanding of it, which in itself can be useful. And if paired with political discourses and activity could be useful. But so what I see it, where I see this going, if I understand your question, is to firstly reinvigorate the scholarly discussion about xenophobia, which has, as I've pointed out, a trend away from complexity and towards repetition of assumptions. And because if nothing else, scholars, I think, have a responsibility in the face of very serious things happening in their society to approach those seriously, and not just dash off a paper full of the same assumptions that have been published for 20 years. Which again, not everyone has done that, but it is something that can be observed, and I think that the whole context can be taken much more seriously in the scholarship on xenophobia in South Africa, elsewhere as well. As I said, this is kind of an endpoint to that question for me for now. There are other more historical directions that the research opened up, have to do with the global connections, and specifically the Atlantic connections that were used, the Atlantic frames of reference that were used to articulate ideas about foreignness in the Cape Colony. So that's personally where I'm headed at the moment. But I think with this this paper, I want to show a different use of history, and yeah, try to make a shift in the research. Whether that falls out, as people just arguing with me, that's okay, as long as it's done seriously.
All right, cool. Thank you. There's 3 hands. Should I take them all at once, or do you want to take one? All right, cool. So Hannah, Gail, and Kasonde, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. And thanks very much, Paddy, for your presentation. Sorry, can you hear me? I'm on my phone, which I'm not normally on. I was hesitant to say a question too early on, because I want to confess that I, despite wanting to read the paper, didn't get a chance, but found the presentation really interesting. And I mean, I think the 2 of your overarching points, I think, in particular, thinking about history as method, and then the comparison to thinking about the study of race and social movements, not just in South Africa, but globally, are both productive for thinking about this question of xenophobia. And then my first thing is really just a comment, because I just quickly looked in your paper if you'd read the work of Tamlin Monson, I think. And I read her work some years ago now, but I found it some of the best work I'd read on trying to understand the kind of sociology of xenophobic violence. And she puts particular incidents of xenophobic violence in from what I can recall from the papers, the 2008 to 2010 period, into a broader history in South Africa, but not as far back as you're going, but rather is emphasizing, for what I can recall, thinking about xenophobic violence in particular places, so taking kind of the question of place seriously, that they're so often in, informal settlements, what we would call them here, and looks at kind of longer histories of squatter politics in South Africa, as well as the kind of established versus newcomer divide, the kind of insider-outsider. So my first question was, one, have you read her work? And have you thought, if you haven't, I would say, I think it'll be really interesting for you to do so. If you have, what of some of the things she draws out there, also the relationship between land and how insider and outsider divisions map onto the politics of land and belonging. What if that's useful to your project, if anything? And then the second question is a broader one, and I guess I'm interested in where this piece of work fits in with your broader work and the broader project. And I'm wondering if you're thinking about history as method as it relates to xenophobia. This is, of course, not really a South African, maybe there are elements of it that take a particular South African form, but what does it do to think about history as method from a global perspective when we think about kind of anti-foreigner sentiment and xenophobia to understanding the South African case? I hope those are clear. Thanks very much.
Hi. I'm sorry to not have my camera on, but it is 7:30 in the morning where I am, and I wouldn't want to subject my visage to the rest of the world. Anyway, I really did enjoy your paper. Thanks very much. And I found it really interesting the way you went back to the Cape Colony. For me, that was fascinating. So I've got one question and a few comments. So the question is, I had no idea that there was an attempt to actually transport convicts to the Cape Colony and that it was rejected. And I think that's really interesting. And I just wanted to know, so were so-called convicts ever transported? Or was it always, or was this the first and only failed attempt? And then secondly, my comments, I think, what sort of really struck me with reading your paper is the connections between boundary making and mobility and xenophobia. And this comes out really clearly, and particularly, the boundaries both on an internal and an external level. So when we look at an external level, okay, like in the Cape Colony, shifting boundaries, like where was the frontier? But also on an internal level, this idea of, I can't help but seeing the discourse against criminality in South Africa today. I mean, that's sort of where, that's where the area that I work in. And the way the criminal is constructed as an other or as a foreigner, and sort of the overlaps between these internal and external forms of foreigner, and they converge very markedly in xenophobic, both the technologies of xenophobic violence as well as the discourse, it's the foreigner who's the criminal, but also even if it's a South African so-called criminal, if you're a criminal, you're regarded as being other or foreign to the polity. So I think sort of that comes out, quite really nicely in your paper, this with the vagabonds and, and then the role of the missionaries, etc. And then the last comment also, the way it's shifting, the way politics and the notion of the constructions of the foreigner, you've shown very nicely how they shift. So, I mean, I don't actually really have anything critical to say about your paper. I found it enormously provocative, and it's great. Thanks very much.
Hi, Paddy. Nice to see you after so long. I had a very quick read of your paper, and like previous speakers found it quite provocative. I learned a lot, so I don't know if there's much I'll add. But I just a couple of clarifications. So you sort of argue that some of the assumptions that people writing about xenophobia in South Africa, some of the assumptions they use are pretty outdated and wrong, and you provide evidence to that effect. So I just want to clarify, are you suggesting, and this one is close to me for obvious reasons, are you suggesting that one of the sort of assumptions that xenophobia is actually Afrophobia is inaccurate? Are you suggesting that there's no element of colorism? I know your paper is not, you're not trying to solve xenophobia, current xenophobia, but I'm just curious around that, because you do show that actually there've been Asians who've been in the line of xenophobic action. But I would think that sort of, speaking broadly of people of color includes Asians. And secondly, I think, I learned so much about, the Cape Colony and how there were these issues around preventing people who had criminals from landing here. My question is, in terms of method, how did you think about classifying ideas as xenophobia versus something that could just be called immigration policy? I mean, I think I did pick up on some of this in terms of perhaps in your research you looked at publications of the time, like the Grahamstown Journal and things like that, and common sentiment. But where is the line in your research, in your deep historical research, between immigration policy and quote unquote true xenophobia? And lastly, I'm wondering if I'm associated with the Brenthurst Library, and I don't, have you done research there? I think there's stuff in that collection, if you haven't, especially the pamphlet collections from this time period, which would add to your research. Yeah, thanks.
I think that's actually 7 questions. I'll start at the, is it okay that I've just jumped in? It's okay.
Yeah, that's
okay.
That's
all right. I'll work backwards. So Kasonde, I'm definitely going to email you and ask you about the last collection you just mentioned. But to your questions, firstly about method and xenophobia or immigration policy, I wasn't too concerned in my research with immigration policy. I did, of course, I did encounter it, and in the bigger piece with more space, I talked about it in more detail. What I was interested in is where it articulated with the politics, the discourses and movements that people created in the colony, and it did provide some background. Sometimes it showed the coincidence of ideas between the colonial population and the colonial government. Sometimes it showed their disagreement as well. And not only the colonial government, but the government in England, particularly around vagrancy. There was a vagrant law passed in the colony that was then disallowed in England as discriminatory by the imperial parliament. And then, of course, with the convicts, that was a decision of the imperial government, supported by the colonial government, and then the people got up basically a revolt against it. But I think that what's important to get to the heart of your question, or what I think is the heart of your question, what's important to me is how foreignness is politicized and explained in society, and not just in the laws. And I think, there have been several studies, historical studies, that show there have been exclusionary immigration laws for over a century in South Africa. But to me, those don't speak to the reasons and the explanations, the discourses and the mobilizations of people rejecting immigrants now. And so that's specifically what I'm interested in. I mean, others have been interested in those laws, and I'm interested in the sort of popular mobilizations, popular xenophobia. Question of preference and approach, I think. But I do think it has consequences, because if we were focused on the law, we miss some details that are, and of course, there's so much that is extra legal about xenophobia in South Africa now, and is not and is in strange contradictory relationships with the official discourses. So that's the question of method that you bring up. You learn different things when you focus on different things. On the question of Afrophobia, I think what's important is to emphasize the multiple, what I'm talking about are multiple ways that xenophobia can be mobilized. It can mean different things, even in a very similar or the same context. So no, it's not wrong to say that xenophobia in South Africa at times is Afrophobic. It's not inaccurate, but when you're speaking about the past 25 years, it may be, and I believe it is inaccurate to say that all of it is Afrophobic, or that all of it is racialized, which has sometimes been an assumption. Now, there is a particular racialized element to xenophobia in South Africa. I did not experience xenophobia in South Africa. But in comparison, thinking back to the comparison in the Cape Colony, racialization, racism provided a particular part of the discourse around xenophobia, but not all of it. And this leads me into actually Gail's discussion of criminality. When there was a farmer in the Eastern, it's now the Eastern Cape, talking about the incursions, I believe was his word, of Africans into the colony, stealing of cattle and that kind of thing, that whole colonial Eastern Cape thing, the whole cattle thing. But his point was not about the race of the people who were supposedly committing the crimes. It was about their foreignness. So his question to his peers in the meeting of settler men, his question was, would we let a Frenchman or a Spaniard do this? We have enough problems and enough crime that the English people are doing. Should we be letting foreign people do this? So foreignness was central to that question. And I think that is where I am trying to situate the discussion of xenophobia, is to focus on when foreignness is politicized, when it's politicized, particularly as subversive or threatening, and not just having to do with the origin of where people are from, whether they're from beyond a certain border or not. When is their foreignness emphasized? As Gail, you mentioned boundary making and mobility. That's so essential to this history, but also I think to the present. When is foreignness important? When is it not about a national boundary? Or when is it not about, where a nationality, where people are from? To the convicts in the Cape Colony, no, that particular episode I talked about was in 1849. That was not the first time. Before there was even a Dutch colony, the British had left like 8 criminals there. I think it was like 1615. They left some criminalized guys there, and some of them died, and then the other ones they picked up after a while and took them back to England and hanged them. Then the Dutch, of course, used it as a place to send convicts from Asia, there had been some, as far as the British colony, there'd been some different ideas floated about whether to use it as a penal settlement or not. What's interesting about the particular episode in 1849, though, is that the colonists were basically begging for European laborers. They needed labor, firstly, but they wanted them to be European. But they didn't want them to be those Europeans. So they created it through, it would take more time maybe than I have to explain in detail, but they created the foreigners out of those convicts. They did not belong in the colony. They were bound to team up with foreign people of various kinds. And that foreignness was explicit. It wasn't, it's not maybe this gets to Kasonde again. This is not just my supposition about when, that might be foreignness. That might be xenophobia. No, this is explicit foreignness, whether it's people or politics, ideas that are cast as alien somehow to the colony. And maybe that ties into the question from Hannah about the globality of my questions. This, in a way, is very local. My research was very local. And the questions I asked were local in a different way. So my research was about the Cape Colony. My questions were about South Africa. But the Cape colonial history became opened to a very wide world that basically was the knowledge and experience of the people creating xenophobia in the Cape Colony, the settlers themselves who were involved in those processes, what they knew about, and those were in general other colonies and England. They talked about the Caribbean. They talked about even the Caribbean that wasn't British. They talked about that there's part of their worldview. Talked about the Caribbean. They talked a lot about Ireland. They talked about England. And so there is, in that way, a global question. And as I said, that's something I, in terms of historical research, probably will pursue. But there's also the present context, and is there a global question there too? So the most kind of thorough book about xenophobia in the United States is a history, and it goes back to the mid 18th century, and basically its argument is that xenophobia is an ideology and a form of racism. And it's a very interesting book, and it elaborates a lot of different ways that xenophobia has appeared in the history of the United States. But to me, and to come back to our conversation today, to go to the paper and the research, it doesn't account for differences. It creates a narrative of xenophobia, but there's sort of a sidelining of context, even where it's very fleshed out and full, and the research is thorough. We come to think of xenophobia from our perspective right now, not what was xenophobia to someone in 1750, but what is xenophobia? What do we assume xenophobia is now? And I think that's a problem with even how we ask about now. As I've said, we assume xenophobia is a certain thing. And that question, the question of asking a different question, I think could be asked in many contexts around the world, not just in South Africa. I mean, if you read any news, you'll see these questions come up in India and Europe and the United States and Australia, and those are some of just the most obvious ones. Monson's work, yes, I've read it. And as I say, there are very good studies of xenophobia, but the quality and the frequency of good studies has declined since about the time that the piece I believe you're talking about was written. And I think that what's important is that those kinds of things are ignored. Not just her work, but a lot of the really good work on xenophobia. Something in your description reminded me of Noor's chapter about xenophobia also. The local politics of insider and outsider. And so these aren't taken seriously in subsequent research. Xenophobia, not to beat a dead horse, but xenophobia has become something that, you know, people can quickly write something, I think, and not take into account the many very good studies that have been done. Are we out of time, or what's up?
Yes, we still have time.
Okay.
And John has had his hand up for quite a bit. If there's any more hands, I think we still have time to squeeze one or two more questions.
Okay.
But in the meantime, John, you can go ahead.
Thank you. I'm finding it a very interesting discussion, but I'd like to ask if you or anyone else that you know of had looked at xenophobia in African communities in the 19th century and earlier. After all, Africans were living here in South Africa, and colonists came from outside. How did African people react to that? Now, we have some evidence, well, we know very much that the Africans were resisting colonization, but not that may be different to xenophobia, I'm not sure. And I mean, in certain places, Africans actually welcomed foreigners coming in. But xenophobia came from that point of view. After 1910, this probably changed. Because you had the Union, and now whites in South Africa were no longer colonists. They considered themselves anyway as indigenous. They had their own government, and they weren't subordinate to, at least for most things, to the British government. And so one assumes that something changed. And how did it change in African communities in the way they saw the whites? And then later, whites actually defined themselves as indigenous and defined Africans as foreigners. We see this with the Bantustan in particular, where Africans actually had their citizenship taken away from them and defined as foreigners, to the point that if an African wanted to go overseas, it was very difficult. If they could only get Bantustan citizenship, and that wasn't, accepted anywhere else. And if I'm remembering right, Africans, say from the Transkei, who wanted to come to Johannesburg, needed some kind of a passport. So you had this change which has taken place. Has anyone looked at that? You know, and in particular, my first question, about how Africans looked at the colonists and settlers coming into their country. But that's the end of the question, brother.
Okay, thanks. So to thinking about the 20th century history, sort of after colonial power was established and not in flux as it was for much of the 19th century. After Union, etc., that that is another history to explore. That is not for two reasons. That's not what I was focused on. One, just because I was focused on the early 19th century, but also because I was not trying to create the story of xenophobia in South Africa from whenever 1800 till now. So it is something else to explore. Maybe me, maybe someone else. But it is very interesting, and I'm not sure how much foreignness has been the focus of that history. I think that the point you make is made. Africans were rendered foreign in what's now South Africa. What became South Africa, whether it was the Union or the Republic. But has that foreignness been explored? I'm not positive. Again, it's not my area of expertise. And I think that, given what we talked about today, that question of foreignness could be very important. What are the other ways? We've seen this. We know about the exclusionary immigration regime of apartheid. We know about the rendering of Africans foreign, but as I found in exploring a different time period, a different context, there were surprising meanings of foreignness and politicizations of foreignness, which I think would be very interesting to explore in any context, including 20th century South Africa. Because yes, there were differences to what was happening before, and also to what's happening now. And a lot of the historical gestures of xenophobia research point to South Africa's exclusionary past. But I think that's very clear. There is an exclusionary past. But let's if I may plug my point one more time, let's focus on what did foreignness mean in different ways there. So, and your first question, how African people react to outsiders. There's been research about that, of course, across the continent. And I think you mean specifically pre-colonial context. Yes, there have been studies about that. I can't think of them off the top of my head at the moment, but they're out there. And in terms of the Cape Colony, you reminded me of a page in Jeff Perez, The House of Paulo, where he talks about the changing language with which Xhosa people described or named Europeans, from pretty neutral to pretty hostile in a way. But it was my supposition also, or you mentioned this, and it's my supposition that resisting colonization is something very different from xenophobia. I didn't want to get into that. I don't think it should be gotten into, to say, no, actually, that's not legitimate resistance. That's anti-foreignness. But of course, all people react, whether it's welcoming or unwelcoming, to people coming from somewhere else. What's interesting, what your question makes me think of, though, is what's interesting is where those two coincide in the same society, even in the same person. So in South Africa today, as anywhere, but focus on South Africa today, you've got people who are very anti-foreign, and they act on it. And there are people who set themselves up as anti-xenophobic or welcoming of outsiders, and they act on it. But at the same time, the same person, that's one person who, defends a foreign-owned shop in Grahamstown, can hold xenophobic views. So that question of welcoming or xenophobic, I think is it's important where politicization happens, and the reaction to outsiders also in general. It's important. When is it politicized? When does it become a way that people see their problem? When do people see their problems in it? And when do they see the solutions to the problems and doing something about it? That's what I'm interested in. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, it doesn't look like there's any more questions. Once again, Paddy, thank you so much for sharing your paper with us. And I apologize once again for being late.
It's okay.
And thanks everyone for, I think that brings us to the end of the seminar. It will be available on the Let's History Workshop YouTube channel. And thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.